Hello, Christ Church. Coming to you from my house today, this very morning, because Sam and I have been feeling a little bit of cold symptoms, and we figured rather than risk it, we'll keep ourselves distant, and so that we don't have any possible complications. We're quite sure it's not COVID, and have a negative test to prove that, but seems to be going around, so we'd rather be safe than sorry. So this morning, I'm going to join you via screen. Yeah. My original plan this week was to kind of do a service-long yearly recap, as we've done past couple years. So I'll do that, but again, it's going to be in a little bit shortened format right now because I'm sitting here at home, I'm not with you guys. But let's talk about it. So in 2022, we had two big series. All right, we talked. The first one that we did was along the book of Esther. And then we did another one. I guess there's three big series: Esther, and then the Psalms, and then also into the big series on Luke, which took up most of our year. And I wanted to key in on those series with Esther and with Luke. And on the surface, right, trying to relate these two books is interesting because they seem to be very different. One, Esther, never mentions God. It's in the Old Testament, and the setting is almost exclusively among the richest, most powerful, and most famous people in the entire world, right? We're in palaces, we're in courts, we're in the crux of kingdoms. And then in the other, in Luke, then we've got Jesus. Explicitly mentioned. God is explicitly mentioned. Now we're in the New Testament, and Jesus focuses his ministry on the poor and the oppressed and the marginalized and the cast-outs from society, which is so very far removed from where Esther and most of her story took place. And yet, between the two of them, the patterns of both of those books is remarkably similar, and is something that we see throughout the Bible in the way that God tells his story and unfolds the history of the world as we get to read it today. And some of those things that you see in both of those stories were the comparison of earthly power and earthly privilege between that and God's kingdom, and the meaninglessness of earthly things when compared to the things that God provides. You see God's unfolding intercession on behalf of his God. Even though he's not explicitly mentioned in Esther, he's present in every single scene and setting and interaction and conversation. And then you see God's plan for the world being fulfilled. Now, obviously, you see it quite explicitly with Jesus, but then even in Esther, you see kind of a bookend to the Old Testament story and the desires that God has for his people being fulfilled, which then would be fulfilled to an even greater extent in Luke. And then there's this pattern, and there's many others to be mentioned here, but the pattern that I'd like for us to focus on today, and I think will launch us well into 2022, is how God develops and disciples his people to be fruitful stewards of his kingdom. And he starts off with this. One of the things that you notice right away in both of these stories is that God chooses us without regard to our status and position in the world. Esther, right? Esther was a teenage girl in a society that did not value women, to put it lightly. They used and abused women and saw them as objects, and there were decrees that demeaned women, and yet God chose a woman to be the main character of this story, to be the main person through whom he's working through. And then you got the disciples, right? You see Jesus going out and choosing the disciples, and they range from a religious zealot to a societal parasite. And most were uneducated, and almost all of them were pretty clueless about what Jesus was going to do. And so clearly Jesus isn't choosing them on their merits. And so one of those things that is incredibly comforting about this is that when we say that God chooses us, he does it before we're ever deserved to be chosen, right? It's not a matter of proving ourselves and then he'll say, oh, okay, now I'll use you, now I'll work with you, now I'll develop you. No, God chooses us well before we ever deserve to be chosen. And honestly, does anyone ever deserve to be chosen? Well, not really, but look at the people that he has chose, right? Esther, beyond just being a teenage girl, she wasn't a natural leader in and of herself. She was quite timid, which is appropriate for her age, right? She's a teenager and very uncertain and just very out of sorts through the first half of the story. Just a lot of things are happening to her without her really being able to ever take charge or be this fearless leader that perhaps we may envision to be what the people that God likes to use. And then the other people in the story, the Israelites, right? The Israelites were not following God in the way that he called them to, but even still, God chooses them. And perhaps that's more closely the people that we should identify with is the Israelites, the people in the background, the people needing a savior, the people needing someone for God to elevate, to help and save them. And then you got the disciples, you got the people that Jesus chooses in his gospel, a very unremarkable group. Their faith was nothing to write home about. They were impulsive, they're pretty immature, they're really concerned with the things on earth, and their own status and power and privilege was everything that Jesus was not concerned about. And yet he still chose them. And so Christ Church, my hope, and one of the things I'd like for us to take away and apply is the way that God chooses us. Now, one of the wonderful things that I love about all of us, about all of you, is you guys are an incredibly humble bunch. There is a large dosage of humility in Christ Church and in the people and the elders and the deacons and in the general people that come in church and are a part of our community. And it's an incredible gift. It's an incredible sense of, the gift and the working and the fruit of the Spirit in our church. And yet, one of the cautions on that is that we can err too far on this side and go beyond simply being humble and into something else. We can believe that we are not capable of taking on leadership roles or capable of taking on responsibilities in God's kingdom, thinking that perhaps I don't know enough, perhaps I don't feel like I'm good enough to do this. I need to know more. I need to know more structures. I need to constantly be in a mode of preparation before I'm able to do something. We may not, I've often heard from some of you that you don't feel equipped to lead or to teach or to disciple others and would like a lot more training in that respect. And I think that's a healthy thing and a wonderful thing to acknowledge our own dependency for help. But the thing is that if God chooses us, then he will also empower us to do what he's called us to do. And so my encouragement, right, is to be willing to step into roles of responsibility within the church, of leadership, of teaching, of be willing to be someone in a position to disciple. And then be, as what goes on, we'll talk about here in a second, is that when God chooses us to step into these things, right, I'm discerning whether he is choosing you or not, because sometimes he may not be choosing us to go to one thing and to go to another. But God will develop us. And oftentimes, and as we see this in our stories, in Esther and in Luke and in the life of Jesus, it's not easy. Oftentimes, God will use hardship to mold us. If you look at Esther and the Israelites, they were literally facing genocide. It doesn't get much harder than that. The disciples, God called them to leave everything that they knew about life to follow him. Jesus told them, and he told the people of Israel, that the cost of discipleship was everything. And he meant it. Right? And then watches the disciples, and perhaps one of the most soul-crushing blows, the very one that they thought was the Messiah, the very one they were following, the very one they'd given their entire lives to follow, was killed. And they were left without a leader, without their teacher. And it goes to show that stepping into God's calling is going to require going through hardship. Now, let's be real here. We're not facing genocide. We do not face a physical existential threat to our lives that many of our brothers and sisters around the world do face on a daily basis. But we are called to live with that understanding of our dependency on God, that our very lives, whether we know the existential threat in front of our faces or not, we do completely depend upon God in every area of our lives. And like the disciples, following God is going to feel at times like we're giving up everything. Jesus talked a lot about money in our series and in Luke. There's many times where he talked about money, and as the wealthiest nation on earth and as a suburb that is quite wealthy, we really need to pay attention and heed Jesus' repeated warnings that we cannot serve both money and God. It's a hard message. Yet it's one that we really need to be thinking about and pondering and considering and evaluating in our own lives. And then as a society in general that individualizes that, rather that idolizes individual freedom, we talk a lot about individuality, our freedoms as individuals, the rights that we have as single persons. We must also notice how Jesus and the Bible in general talks about salvation in a communal sense, meaning salvation isn't talked about as the salvation of individuals, but rather the salvation of the entire nation, the entire tribe, the entire people, the entire group, the entire church at stake. It's not just us as individuals that Jesus looks at getting saved. He looks at a full community as the vehicle of salvation. I'll never forget, in seminary, one of my professors, when I was taking Greek, shocked me, but he made this declaration that if any of you are getting straight A's and one of your classmates is really struggling, almost failing, then you are in great danger of sinning. Now, I'm going to be real honest, right? I've been taught my entire life, and it was one of my foundational identifying features about myself was all about getting good grades, right? That has been drilled into me throughout all of school, that getting good grades was my responsibility as a student. And so now for a professor to call out that, hey, maybe learning isn't all about me, and maybe it's more about the community of people that I'm learning with. One, goes completely against the educational system that I was brought up in. But two, just was a complete reorientation of how I thought about life in general, learning. And the thing is that's you can apply that and continue to apply that in the rest of life. If we are comfortable, if we're not having to worry about food or clothing or filling up the car with gas, and our neighbor is, chances are that we're in great danger of sinning, of not using the things that God has given us to love our neighbors in the way that God has loved us. God uses hardship. And it's a fine balance. It's an interesting debate always, and I'm not going to get into this now of whether God is the one who authors the hardship or whether that hardship is simply a result of the sinful world that we live in. And I think there's a big argument to be made for that. But through the hardship that living in a world of sin inevitably brings, God develops his disciples to rely on him with our lives, to grow in our wisdom, maturity, and endurance, to clearly understand that our only hope in life and death is him. But God not only chooses us and then develops us through hardship. No. God empowers us to carry out our calling as we go forth, as we seek to do the work and the calling that he's given us. Look what happened in God's stories. Israel, in the book of Esther, finally, for the first time in hundreds of years, if not their entire existence, turned to God, prayed, fasted, repented, their hearts completely reoriented towards God. Everything that God had desired for them to do from the very beginning of their existence, they were finally doing when faced with the hardship of genocide. And they rejoiced in him as a result of it. And the world rejoiced in God as a result of the events that happened in Esther. And you look at Esther, she was this timid, shy almost teenage girl, very uncertain, very unsure of herself. And by the end of the story, she becomes a confident, wise, discerning queen who saves an entire nation. And as for the disciples, right, they were taught by Jesus himself. That is an incredible way in which God is empowering them. But then not only that, when Jesus left, he promised that he was going to send the Holy Spirit to empower their ministry while he was gone. Which, not coincidentally at all, this is entirely planned, right? That's what we're going to study next. We're going to be going through the book of the Acts of the Apostles, or simply called Acts. Luke and Acts were two books written by the same author, by Luke, for the same purpose, to his friend Theophilus, to tell him about all the things that were happening about Christendom and the way and the movement that was going on. And so that's what we're going to do. We've studied Jesus and his ministry and his calling upon the world and the disciples and the mission that he came and completed. And now we get to see God sending out his disciples and the actions that they do as God's followers who have studied with him and been empowered by the Holy Spirit. And my hope is that as we study the book of Acts, I'll say my hope and my challenge for us, Christ Church, is to consciously enter into the development and discipleship that God has been doing in this church and has for us as a church. Right? And so what exactly does this look like on a daily basis? Well, I mean, that's what we're going to find out together. That's part of what this study is going to be. And I'm not going to tell you the answers before we get into it, right? Because this is the thing that we're going to be discovering every single week and working on and studying and working through and applying and figuring out, that's what it was at that point in time in history. What is the takeaway for us? What is the application for us here in the 21st century? But the one thing I can tell you, right, the one thing I want to leave you with is this, is that discipleship, following God, starts in the same way that it started with Esther and Israel and the disciples. It starts first and foremost with recognizing that our very lives depend on God's grace and mercy. A number of the parables that Jesus told talked about people trusting in their wealth and reveling in the comfort that it afforded them. And yet, in the blink of an eye, all of that can be taken away. In the blink of an eye, everything can be laid bare, and our complete and utter dependence upon God can be brought before our eyes. So, Christ Church, my hope for us is that we would first and foremost delve into that need in our lives to continually depend on God's grace and mercy. And through that, when we do that, inevitably, we're going to be putting our God, our heavenly family, the kingdom that we've been called to be citizens of, first, which is the way our lives should be oriented. And so, Christ Church, as we start off 2022, this is my call, this is my challenge, this is what we will be delving into and what we, quite frankly, need to do as a church. We've been through, we've talked about, we've explored much of the hardship of the history of our church. We've seen our dependence upon God's grace and mercy, seen how our own sin requires repentance, requires and it illustrates our need for forgiveness and how grateful we can be and should be for what Jesus has done. And now, Christ Church, let's do something with that. Let's go forth and do the mission that God has for us. Amen.